Right. So we as professional services, indeed, we see a lot of projects, mostly when a new customer joins or when an existing customer is looking for that next best thing. So I have 6 points that I would like to point out as building blocks for a successful project. And of course, as Theresa said, I'm going to use 2 case studies today for Arval and Proximus. Before that, though, I do want to go deeper into a subject that I would like to start with. Does anybody recognize this image? Yes? Okay. This is Domino's, yes. Sorry for the unclear picture, I got it from a video. So this is an epic domino show that took place in 2016 by an Austrian team. Right, so they had a whopping number of blocks being toppled, as I understand is the right terminology. But what surprised me, it also holds the world record for longest domino wall, 41.40 meters long. So that's a great accomplishment. I can only imagine how much time get into this to plan something out like this, right? Do we have the right blocks, the right material? Do we have the right people? You know, so we have the team that we can work with. Do we have the right planning to get this done? I think this also works well within the sales enablement or any project, basically, that you have. It makes you think, doesn't it? In a lot of ways. So, of course, a sales enablement project doesn't involve dominoes, though, so don't worry about that. Okay, so keep that picture in mind. Of course, I do want to talk a little bit about the companies that I will discuss further. So, of course, most of you know Arval. They actually were one of the SAM Awards winners yesterday for business impact, right? I hope at the end of this session it becomes clear why they were chosen to do that. So they are of course, they offer flexible car usage solutions. Their fleet stretches over to 1.1 million, and they have, they basically have customer base from individuals like yourself and me, and also large corporates. They are dedicated to have an infrastructure for the future, right? That includes a digital ecosystem. That's where the sales enablement project also comes into. The goal, of course, is a digital working program for all employees within Arval. That's the goal. First of all, of course, they're looking at people that drive revenue, which is, of course, the sales and marketing organization. So they were the first up, and the sales enablement program was started, and that's also where Showpad came in. Some of the challenges that they faced, though, because Arval is actually, not enough people know this, but Arval has been a customer for Showpad for quite a while. But most of them were regional entities, right? So at some point, of course, they were looking for a more global approach when it comes to sales leadership, sales enablement. So challenges were, of course, well, we've been talking about this for the last 2 days, right? So the buyer is changing, which means that the sales and marketing organization need to change as well. Because there were regional initiatives, it was a very big challenge to go from a regional approach to a global approach. There was, of course, a need for consistent messaging, and I think all marketeers appreciate that. So for messaging and marketing on all levels. While doing that, again, because there were these regional silos, it was very important to set governance and accountability lines. And to respect, to some degree, the regional flexibility that is required. The other customer that I will further talk about is Proximus. I think most of you, at least Belgians under us, who know who they are. They're the leading provider of telecom, IT services, and content. They have challenges where they work currently. So they're a customer with Showpad since 2015, right? So they've been on the content side. They've worked out, they've rolled out the Showpad platform, but they have about 450 sales people that always have something better to do, right? Which is probably something that everybody can relate to. So captivating their attention is somewhat underestimated. They have about 100 exclusive partners that they've also recently enrolled into the Showpad platform. Partners, of course, there are some traditional barriers that you have to overcome to ensure that they feel very close to the brand and to the business. As a leading provider, of course, they have a continuous evolution of new technologies, which of course brings in new content, which resides to that, especially around product information and other tools. They also have a mixed audience, and it took me a little while to put this on the slide because everybody knows this, right? So you have early adopters, and then you have salespeople that are a bit hesitant, right? So we have also laggards that we have to take into account. And the challenge is that the early adopters are not the challenge, right? Those people are with any platform straight away. They like it, they use it, they feel great. It is getting those laggards onto a certain level that you feel comfortable and you feel that everybody is adopting to some point to the platform. Right, going back to the building blocks that I wanted to talk about. First of all, what we've seen, especially with these cases, is that you need to know your organization. When you refer to a sales enablement project, the first two things that come into mind are sales and marketing, right? Jason just talked about the alignment on that. That said, though, when talking about sales enablement, there are other questions that start to pop up, right? What about branding? What about messaging? What about GDPR? What about local policies that you have to do? What about training, communication, right? Who is responsible for this? Who is accountable? Some of these questions can be answered by one person, because that person is taking, at this point, that role. Great. But in reality, though, there are a number of different teams that come into play that you have to work with. So the landscape starts to look a little bit more like this, right? Sales and marketing are still massively important and the foundation of the sales enablement project. But there are other teams that need to be consulted, challenged, informed of what you're doing with the project. If you don't do that, you will have, at a later point in life, a later point in the project, you will get to obstacles which are very hard to overcome at that point or will delay the project by a massive amount. On top of that, in most organizations, you also have to think about the different levels. Right? So you have the global level, where there's, of course, I would say corporate messaging, branding will come out of that. And then you have, depending on the size of company, you have business units that will own the content piece, that will create new content and solutions. And also, of course, you have your regional markets or just countries as a whole, which you have to take into account. But because guess what? That's where your salespeople live. Right? So if you don't take that into account, you'll get into trouble the moment that you roll out this project. So just a reality check. I don't want to scare anybody, right? I fully appreciate this might add some complexity, but knowing and spending time on this up front will remove a lot of the friction later on in the project. For Proximus and Arval, the stories are slightly different, right? So Proximus is the leading provider on the Belgian market, but they have a high load of different sales teams because, of course, they need to be able to handle the business in the different levels of the business and profiles that come with that. Arval, on the other case, has 29 regional or countries, regional silos, and, of course, with that, the same amount of different sales teams to make sure that it is able to work from a corporate to an individual level. Once you understand your organization, you need to start and look at your maturity. Right? We believe that the end goal should always be the buyer, right? The buyer experience. So how customer-centric is your organization? Understanding your maturity is key, as it determines the further course of actions. Initially, a sales enablement program is, of course, and should be focused on content. And also, while you're focusing on content, of course, the impact in the beginning is mostly related to the seller efficiency, right? Does everybody find the content in one spot? How much time do they need to look for content? How can we speed up that time? Those are elements that you need to take care of. But also think about, okay, we have content available, but what is the governance around that? Do we actually have people, do we have a process in place that will allow us, once we get content and scale that out to a larger organization, that we're able to keep up the pace with bringing out that content and publishing it forward to the full organization? Once you have your content in place, the second thing is, it's great that salespeople get relevant content, don't get me wrong, but then it comes, so how do you know that the salesperson is ready to have that conversation with the customer, right? So content in context, right, which you've probably heard several times before. But more of that is knowledge validation. So how are you sure that when a sales rep goes out with the relevant content, is ready to have that engaging conversation with the customer? Third level would be where you're linking the content, and of course, you know that people are validated, and you bring it to the deal, right? So making sure that content is very relevant to the deal. And then, of course, final and most customer-centric area would be where you bring in the alignment, the 3 to 5 year goal of the business, and get that fully aligned with your marketing and sales initiatives. KPIs, key performance indicators, are essential to any type of project. Sales enablement is no different. However, they need to be meaningful and they need to be measurable. And in sales and marketing, that's not always the case. What is also very important is that KPIs are unique for every organization. There's unfortunately no template, no checklist that you can use and say, okay, I've marked those KPIs, I'm ready to go. With KPIs, though, and that's what this picture is trying to say, is that you need to align sales and marketing, that we've just heard Jason talk about, but also make sure that all of the KPIs from an organizational level, at least to some point and some degree, level up to your KPIs of your project. For Arval, they had some strong KPIs from the start, again, measurable. Initially, a project timeline to roll out to 29 countries in 7 months. As I said, this is part of a digital worker program for all employees. So the first 2 focus points are content delivery, right? They're very much at the beginning of that maturity level. And relevant, making sure that content is relevant for the customer. Second is increase for sales productivity. And sales productivity is, okay, how do you measure that, right? So the first KPI that they came up with was meeting preparation time, which was very important to them. So they wanted to make sure that their meeting preparation time decreased. They have some other KPIs. They work with a digital sales index, which is a combination of how active are people on Showpad, how many meetings are performed by their conference call system, Skype. They have a social score index, which is measured, and also they have a strong belief around CRM, which means that there is also a measurement on how frequently they're using CRM. What I find very interesting is that they see their salespeople as internal customers. So they are bringing out a CSAT survey to make sure that the customers, their sales reps, feel comfortable, and they want to get over 80% on the first iteration. For Proximus, Proximus is slightly different, right? So Arval is in a major overhaul, so it's kind of a reset, basically. For Proximus, they've been with Showpad for a while, so what they need to focus on is how do we keep adoption growing, right? So how do we make sure this platform and the content is being used? So of course, everyone using the app is one of their KPIs. Overall adoption of all of the functionality that a sales platform brings with. Right. And the speed of publishing, which is very important. Remember the high amount of content which is published, so they wanted the speed of publishing within 24 hours whenever they decided to bring something out. Once you've set your KPIs, at that time, you need to expect change. And again, I don't want to talk too much about this, but Professor Obang from yesterday's session had a really good element, right? So why do we need change management? According to studies and analysts, 50% of barriers for success can be directly linked to people. Reluctance to change, remember the mixed audience. Inadequate project execution, inadequate project management as a whole. Developing a change management plan will eventually you will always benefit from this, right? If we look at an unmanaged change in project, is that the expectations are probably way too high. Once they start working with, they say, oh no, what did we get here? I don't know, how do I have to use this on a daily basis? And then the final acceptance, when you've put quite some effort into this to convince them of using this plan, will be at a certain degree. If you have some type of change management, your expectation might be a little lower in the beginning, but it might be more realistic, which means that the moment they start using it, they understand, okay, right, so there is a slight moment there, a moment of, oh, I have to start using this, but the eventual result and success of the project will be higher in all cases. So for Arval, what this say, it meant that there were some risks that they need to make sure they had under control. They had the risk of that hard reset, and they didn't take it for granted. So they knew that they had to do the major overhaul and ensure that they go from regional, smaller initiatives from a sales enablement perspective to a global level. The regional silos, I would say spirited timeline, that's what I called it, right? 7 months for 29 countries. Yes, and different roles and different teams that they had to take into account. So the focus for them was to make sure that they could cope with this change was very strong project management, right? So they had a steerco, a committee that had timely or weekly meetings to make sure that everybody was ready on the project. There were necessary feedback loops, there were flagging, early flagging capabilities. There was all of these elements that you need when you take on such a project. And keep on appreciating those regional differences is key. Proximus, so the risk for them right now is that, again, those field sales reps, they don't think they have enough time, right? So they always see this as a burden. So how do you overcome this? And I guess that's something that some of these people here in the audience can relate to. The usual barrier for the partners, right? So again, how do you make sure that your exclusive partners feel part of that brand and also get the necessary content? And old habits die hard. So if a sales rep doesn't fully believe it, they will go back to creating your own content, and you're back to square one, and you can start over. So for their focus was communication and learning, right? Communication, very quickly sending out small bits of pieces, and learning, do a lot of training, but I'll come back to that in a minute. So once you kind of know what change, and of course, some part, you'll never know what to expect, right? So some part of that change will always occur. But at least if you get the big blocks out, you can focus on the smaller elements, and it will not crush your project in any time. At that time, you start talking about planning. A good friend of mine, just kidding, I like this quote. It got stuck in my head because it's spot on, right? A goal without a plan is just a wish. And to some degree, I always sometimes say, okay, yeah, it's completely correct. If you don't have a plan in mind, you will never accomplish it. So let's take a look at the Arval project line. So how did they overcome this element? So you can see on the right side, you see the 7 months of rollout. Before that time, they did their due diligence, right? So they had about 3 months where they had to think about, okay, how do we go from regional initiatives? And something to bear in mind as well is that I talked about maturity. With Arval, actually the maturity was different. in the different regions. There were some that are already using Showpad and liking it and actually were already thinking about that readiness phase, whereas other regions never heard of Showpad, never knew about, okay, how do we bring and deliver this content, right? So what they did is they, and actually, well, I was part of that, they got into a room, right, and they made sure that they had representation of every part of the business, for every regional element was in there, and they spend a lot of time of going through the number of user stories. So which user stories in the regions match and map? So which ones can we very quickly see as one and go further? So they took quite some time on that. And then what they did is they had a first pilot with the Showpad platform, just to make sure that it validated the user stories that took place. Finally, they had feedback and evaluation, where they kind of created their, what we call a minimal viable product, right? So they kind of said, okay, these are the user stories that are critical for our business. These are some user stories that we know that is further roadmap for the platform and is not critical right now, so we're going to put it on the backlog. So they kind of created their MVP that they wanted to then roll out to the full organization. So the dotted line is, of course, where Showpad comes in, right? So where they said, yes, we're going ahead with this project. And from that point onwards, it was all about rollout. So initially, they had to think of a global structure. So again, everybody had their own structure. So now they had to think about, okay, how do we want to do this? And this was very much from a global perspective, but again, bringing in people, bringing in different parties from a regional level to ensure that whatever they were created later on didn't cause any friction. Again, expect change. Messaging and branding was very important for any brand, I guess, but also for Arval, right? So there was quite some time that was spent into that and fully pushed from a global perspective. And then we had to do a content migration, right? Because we had all these regional silos, which means that we had to make sure that all that content that they used before was migrated to the new global account of Arval, in this case, within Showpad. Once the migration was done, there was regional training with, I would say, a few frictions going on, again, because of this plan, and then launch, I think, around April, May of this year, they launched. So they had from September, October last year until May that they actually rolled out everything to the team. Final block that I wanted to talk about is adoption and continuous learning, because if you do not think about this right now, and when you start your project, right, what do you do when you say, okay, we rolled out, and then what, right? So you need to think about adoption from the get-go. Of course, there is mid to long-term adoption plans, and that's where our customer success organization comes in place, but you need to think about these initial adoption metrics as well. When people, and this is not an old friend of mine, but in God we trust, all others must bring data. And this is where people go to when they talk about adoption, right? So adoption is, okay, let's see those metrics, right? Let's see how people are adopting the platform, the strategy. It is a very important measure for adoption. However, not everything is easily tracked. What about CSAT? What about day-to-day activity? How are you going to track that? Sometimes you can't get that with core data. There are some ways to enrich data, though. Surveys being a very effective tool that we've seen in projects. Although one would argue that it is subjective data, because basically you're basing yourself on an emotional state of somebody else at that time. It does allow you to capture personal and emotional states, which are even more important to understand, okay, how is this adopting? How are people liking this new way of working? Again, referring back to Professor Obeng yesterday, where it's all about that central core and instinct and emotion that drives people. This is where I want to bring in Proximus a little bit more, because this is where they are at right now. So what they've figured out is that dedicated training resources is definitely the way to go. You need to spend some money, basically, to get a lot of results back. What they do is they have frequent email campaigns and blogs that they send out whenever something comes out, which could be content related. In this case, it's actually related to functionality in the platform. that you want to introduce. Classroom and webinar training, and if I can believe Proximus, classroom training, or actually face-to-face training, is the best way forward, especially when you have a mixed audience and field reps that don't believe that they have the time to actually sit down or watch a webinar. One source of truth. Everything, recordings of webinars, anything that is related to getting content out and training regarding to the platform, it all runs on the platform. So that whenever somebody asks something, it's just, it's on Showpad, right? Very interesting is that, of course, they can use it offline and then use it later on for retraining or anything else. Or if they don't have that time right now, they could have that time in tomorrow. Bite-sized chunks, very small pieces. And I think that also is, again, with the change element, right? People are reluctant to change. So if you make the change very small, you will progress, actually, and probably in a higher rate than if you go big or go home, basically. One of the things that Proximus has done is creating an ambassador team. And I think that was a very interesting point. The ambassador team is basically getting some of the champions of Showpad and giving them a mandate to start talking to people, to start preaching about the sales enablement platform, to talk about certain activities, certain day-to-day activities that they've encountered and where sales enablement, in this case Showpad, actually was beneficial to the deal. If you do that, most of the time, again, these would be these early adopters, that ambassador team. At that time, you will bring in those laggards, you will make them understand, because it's a peer-to-peer conversation, which is completely different than if you or myself would be spending time with that salesperson, and making them understand that it actually is beneficial to start working with Showpad. To end my session, just 2 slides on what success looks like. For Arval, they rolled out to 29 regions in 7 months. That's on paper, right? So that's an amazing accomplishment if you look at the size and the level of content that they had to roll out. And they decreased their meeting time from 4 to 1 hours of work to prepare for a meeting going forward. That's exactly why they were the winner of the Business Impact SAM Award yesterday. So a big round of applause for Arval getting this done. Proximus was able to get their time to publishing within 24 hours. 90% of the cases, I think that's a good accomplishment. They increased user activity anytime at the time of posting, right? And that's why you need to have these frequent email campaigns, small blog posts, announcements sent out, so that user activity continues to grow. And they have a consistent increase of platform adoption since they started working with Showpad, and will do so in the remaining future as well. Thank you very much.